My name is Evelyn Monroe, though most folks here just call me Nana Eve. I'm 60 years old, and I've spent most of my life in a little town off the coast of Maine, where the fog rolls in like a secret and never fully leaves. If you're listening, I want you to do me a favor before I start. Hit that subscribe button, and maybe give this video a little like, because what I'm about to share with you, it isn't just a story. It's my confession and my revenge. Every Thursday morning, for nearly 15 years, I wrote a letter. Same paper, same ink, same trembling hand. I'd pour my heart out on those pages, sometimes crying, sometimes laughing to myself. And then I'd seal them in blue envelopes with his name written across the front in neat cursive. To my son, Private Daniel Monroe, U.S. Army. At first, those letters were full of love and worry, stories about home, about how the lilacs were blooming early, how the sea was colder that year, how I missed him at Sunday service. I'd tuck in a photo sometimes, or a clipping from the Bangor Daily News. And he'd write back. Oh, how he wrote back. Every envelope came like a breath of fresh air. He'd tell me about the heat overseas, about his unit, about the men he called brothers. He'd end every letter with, "Don't worry about me, Mama. I'm coming home soon." Those words kept me alive longer than medicine ever could. But then, one day, the letters stopped. At first, I thought maybe he was busy. Maybe the base was moving. Maybe mail got lost, like it sometimes did. I kept writing anyway, every Thursday, even when the postman stopped expecting me. I wrote through hurricanes, birthdays, and Christmases. I wrote through my own loneliness, and still nothing. Until one day, I found out why. And that's where this story really begins. You see, I wasn't always the woman you see now, gray-haired, soft-spoken, sitting in a coastal nursing home that smells faintly of salt and bleach. I used to run a little bakery in town called Eve's Corner Bread. Folks came from 3 towns over for my blueberry muffins and sea salt caramel rolls. My husband, Robert, passed away when Daniel was 12. He was a fisherman, a good man, but the sea doesn't love anyone back. His boat never made it through that October storm. From that day forward, it was just me and my boy. Daniel was my reason for waking up in the morning. He had his father's quiet strength and my stubborn heart. He'd help me mix dough at sunrise, flour up to his elbows, humming Motown songs under his breath. And when he laughed, Lord, it filled the whole kitchen. When he said he wanted to join the military, I was proud. Scared, sure, but proud. He said, "Mama, I'll make you proud. I'll send money, and one day I'll build you a house that faces the water." That was his promise, and I believed him. The first year after he left, I received letters every month. Sometimes short, sometimes long, but always full of love. He'd ask for homemade cookies, so I'd bake them, pack them tight, and send them off with a little note tucked inside. Neighbors would stop by the bakery just to ask, "Heard from Danny lately?" and I'd beam like a proud mama. But then, somewhere between year 6 and year 7, the tone of his letters changed. He wrote less about home, less about me, and more about someone else. Her name was Amira, a woman he'd met while stationed overseas. He described her like poetry, soft-spoken, beautiful, patient. I remember smiling the first time he mentioned her, thinking maybe my boy had finally found love. But then his words grew distant, his sentences shorter. The letters came every 3 months, then 6, then once a year, and then nothing. I kept writing. God help me, I kept writing. Every Thursday morning, I'd sit by the kitchen window, pen in hand, kettle whistling, and pour myself into those pages. Letters that never came back. The mailbox stayed empty, and my heart got heavier when my health started failing. Arthritis, blood pressure, the usual things that come with time. My niece Carla moved me into a nursing home up the coast. It was nice enough, but it wasn't home. And every time I looked out that window toward the sea, I thought of my son. Sometimes, when the nurses came to check on me, they'd see me writing. They'd joke, "You must have a lot of pen pals, Miss Evelyn." And I'd just smile, sealing another blue envelope. But what they didn't know was that I'd been writing to a ghost. See, when I finally decided to ask the Army about Daniel's location, to send the letters directly to his base, the mail came back stamped in red. Return to sender. Recipient not at address. I called the veterans office. They told me he'd been discharged 2 years earlier. No forwarding address. I didn't understand. Why wouldn't he tell me? For weeks, I didn't sleep. Just stared at the box under my bed, filled with 15 years of letters, all written to a man who'd vanished like mist off the ocean. Her voice softens. You can hear her swallow hard. One night, I asked God, did my boy die? Did he forget me? And for a long time, I thought that was the answer, that maybe he'd passed, and no one thought to tell me. Until one evening, Carla came by with her iPad, all cheerful like she always was, and said, "Auntie Evelyn, you should see this. I found Daniel's Facebook." My heart stopped. I hadn't seen his face in years. She turned the screen toward me, and there he was, my boy, older, fuller, smiling, but not with me. He was standing beside a woman, Amira, holding a baby girl. His caption read, "Our little family, finally home." Home. That word hit me harder than a storm ever could, because that wasn't my home. That was theirs. And right then, something inside me cracked. Soft music fades in, haunting and slow. He hadn't died. He'd just left me behind. No phone call. No goodbye. Just a new life, a new family, and a mother sitting in a nursing home, writing letters no one would ever read. I didn't cry that night. Not once. Because sometimes pain sits so deep inside you, tears can't reach it. But what I did do was different. I started writing again. Not letters to my son, but letters to the woman who took him. Letters I never sent. Letters filled with truths, warnings, and, yes, revenge. Because if life was going to fade me out like ink on old paper, then I'd make sure my story left a mark. I didn't sleep much after that night. The image of Daniel on that screen kept me awake. The smile that used to belong to me now belonged to someone else. I stared at that photo until my eyes blurred. The baby in his arms had his same dimple. I whispered to myself, so that's where my letters went. The next morning, I asked Carla if she could show me more. She scrolled through his page while I held my breath. There were pictures of dinners, beaches, a wedding I'd never been invited to. Him in a suit, standing next to that woman in white. I saw the date, 3 years back. 3 years of silence while I was sitting by a window writing to a ghost. I felt something deep in my chest twist like a rope being pulled too tight. Carla didn't notice. She was smiling at the baby picture. "Look, Annie, you're a grandmother," she said like it was good news. I smiled back. That fake kind of smile old folks learn when they don't have the strength to correct you. That night, when the nurses tucked me in, I waited until the hall was quiet. Then I opened my drawer, pulled out one of my old blue envelopes, and ran my fingers over Daniel's name. My hands shook. The letters inside that box suddenly felt heavy, like every word I'd written was pressing down on me. I wanted answers, real ones. So the next week, when Carla came by again, I asked her softly, "Could you help me find his address? Just to send a card for the baby." She smiled, not seeing through the lie. "Of course, Auntie." Within minutes, she found it online, a little house in North Carolina, near a base where he used to be stationed. She even wrote it down for me, neat and careful. That piece of paper burned in my palm like a secret. Over the next few days, I called in a few favors. Old friends, church ladies, one retired postman who used to help me with shipping boxes years ago. I asked small questions, harmless ones, about forwarding addresses and service records. Little by little, I pieced things together. Daniel hadn't just married abroad. He'd married while still enlisted. That meant one thing: the woman he'd met overseas had been approved by his commanding officer. He'd flown her to the States. They'd started a business. He'd told everyone his mother had passed away years ago. When I heard those words, my whole body went cold. Passed away, like I'd just been erased from his story altogether. I wanted to scream, but instead I laughed. That low, quiet kind of laugh you make when the world stops making sense. I spent that night sitting by my window, watching the lighthouse blink across the water. I thought about the boy who used to bring me seashells after school, the one who'd say, "I'll take care of you, Mama." And now he had a whole new life, pretending I didn't exist. That's when something inside me shifted. I wasn't just hurt anymore. I was curious, because no one lies that deep without a reason. So I started writing again, not letters this time, but a little diary, dates, details, things I remembered about his time overseas, who he'd mentioned, the base name, the missions. And then, one afternoon, I made a call to a woman named Mrs. Dean, whose husband had served with Daniel. I'd met her years ago at a memorial. She remembered me right away. "Oh, Evelyn, it's been years. I still remember those cookies you sent the boys." We talked gently at first about health, weather, all that polite stuff. Then I asked as casual as I could, "Do you remember Daniel ever mentioning someone named Amira?" There was a pause, a long one. Then her voice dropped. "Oh, honey, you didn't hear?" My hand tightened around the receiver. "Hear what?" Mrs. Dean sighed. That woman, Amira, she wasn't who he thought she was. She was married when he met her. Her husband was local, but she told Daniel she was divorced. There was a whole mess when it came out. He nearly got discharged over it. My breath hitched. Discharged? But the records say. I know, baby, he had connections. Somebody covered it up. But it ruined him for a while. Guess he rebuilt himself after. I sat there frozen. The line buzzed softly in my ear, while my thoughts spun like a storm. So he hadn't just forgotten me. He'd built his life on lies. That night, I didn't sleep again. The ocean outside felt angry, waves slapping against the rocks like they understood me. I looked at that little box of letters under my bed, and for the first time, I opened every single one. Dozens of envelopes spilled out, some yellowed, some still smelling faintly of flour and cinnamon. And then I saw something. One envelope had been returned years ago with a note stapled to it. Somehow I'd missed it before. The note said, "Recipient declined. Addressee refused correspondence." Refused. That single word broke something final inside me. He hadn't lost my letters. He'd turned them away. My voice cracked when I whispered to the empty room, "You turned your mama away, boy." I pressed that letter to my chest until dawn. By morning, I'd made a decision. I was done waiting for his apology, done begging for a connection he'd buried. If he wanted to erase me, I'd make sure he'd never forget me again. I started with something small. I asked Carla to help me open an email account. She thought it was cute. Nana's getting online, and set it up right there in my room. What she didn't know was that I planned to use it for more than church newsletters. With Mrs. Dean's help, I tracked down a contact from Daniel's unit who still owed her a favor. He confirmed what she'd said, and then told me something even worse. During his time overseas, Daniel had sent money home. A lot of it, but none of it ever came to me. That's when I realized someone had been cashing those checks. Someone had forged my name. Now I knew why my savings never matched what Daniel promised. He thought he'd been supporting me all along, while someone else pocketed the money. That someone was Amira. Suddenly, everything made sense. His silence, his shame, his distance. She'd played him, and he'd chosen her anyway. I felt a fire start in my chest. I wasn't sure if it was anger, heartbreak, or both. But I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't done yet. If you're still with me, sweetheart, just tap that little like button, because what happens next? That's when I stop being the woman who waits. That's when I become the woman who acts. And trust me, you'll want to hear how a 60-year-old grandmother from Maine taught them both what real payback feels like. I remember the exact sound my heart made the night I found that note, a slow, ragged beat that felt like the sea had moved into my chest. For weeks after, I'd wake up halfway through the night and sit with the lamp on, the letters spread across the bed like a paper sea. I read every single one until the words blurred, and the ink felt like a stranger's signature. How many times had I told him to be careful? How many times had I packed his little lunches and kissed the top of his head and watched him walk away with the pride of a mother who'd done her best? Grief is a complicated thing. It curls around you like smoke and sometimes makes you forget which parts are anger and which are sorrow. For a while, I let myself sit in both. I cried in the bathroom where the nurses wouldn't come, the faucet running until the hot water burned my hands, so I could feel something besides the cold absence. I told myself stories about how it might have happened. Maybe he'd been ashamed of me. Maybe Amira had told him to cut ties because of some trouble back home. Each possibility bent me a little until I was nearly unrecognizable. Then one night, I opened the envelope with the stamped note again. Recipient declined. Addressee refused correspondence. I read those words over and over until they lost all meaning but that single, unbearable sting. He had chosen to refuse me, or he had been told to. Either way, I was left on the outside of his life like a photograph tucked in a drawer no one opened. The first person I wanted to blame was Amira. My cheeks still burn if I think about how mean that sounds now. But back then, I wanted someone to pin the blame on. Mrs. Dean told me things, small pieces of conversation from others who'd known Daniel overseas. She said Amira was clever, charismatic, and very good at rewriting a man's mistakes into her own victories. She said she had a way of making a man feel needed and indebted. I imagined an image of them together, and it felt like someone had dumped salt into an open wound. I wanted answers, not fantasies. So I started to gather facts the way I used to gather eggs for the bakery. One at a time, careful, making sure they weren't cracked. First, I made a list of every person who might know something. Former neighbors, old postman, that retired sergeant who still came to the diner on Sundays. I called them with my soft voice and asked for little favors. Do you remember Daniel? I'd say, did he ever mention a woman named Amira? Most people were kind. They answered in half sentences and offered memories that were more like scraps of fabric than a full quilt, but they were enough to stitch a pattern. When I finally sat down and looked at the pattern properly, I realized there were 3 things I could do: find out whether Amira had been dishonest about her past, see whether the money Daniel thought was getting to me had actually been diverted, and if worst came to worst, make sure the world knew how easily a man's life could be rewritten by another. I knew how to be patient. I'd kneaded dough for 40 years. Patience is something you muscle into your bones. So I began with small legal things. I called the bank, softly at first, then with more insistence, asking if there were any checks or transfers in Daniel's name that had gone unclaimed. The clerk was polite, but useless at first, but a kind manager took my call after I spoke long enough about how I used to run Eve's Corner Bread and how Daniel used to eat the blueberry muffins before Sunday service. People listen to stories. It's one of the few advantages old women have in town. It turned out there were oddities in the accounts. Money had been wired to accounts with different names. When I mentioned it to Mrs. Dean, she told me about a time when Daniel had been furious because money he'd sent hadn't been cashed where it should have been. He'd said something about paperwork and someone covering it up, but he never explained. That was the first real doorway I'd found into something rotten. The second move was less about paper and more about presence. I started going to places I hadn't in years: service reunions, the diner where old soldiers met, the post office, carrying a bag of cookies or a teapot. It was like stepping into a play where I already knew my lines. Folks warmed up and people began to talk. Old soldiers remembered details others had forgotten. A woman who'd worked at the base clinic mentioned seeing a young woman with a baby who always carried expensive bags and never seemed to know what to say when asked about family. A retired postal worker I'd known for decades got quiet and told me he'd seen packages being intercepted, sometimes parcels that never made it to the box because someone signed for them instead. It wasn't much, but it was sticky. Facts clung to it. I kept my words measured. This isn't the sort of thing you yell in a diner. Accusation without foundation destroys you faster than the thing you accuse. Instead, I let the people I spoke with remember things and offer them up as if they'd been thinking about them for a while. A seed has more chance to grow if it feels like it was always the right place to plant it. There were nights when I wrote letters and then burned them, not to hide the words from anyone. No, burning letters felt like a ritual. I'd write the things I couldn't say aloud, the times I'd sat in the back pew and pretended there was a reason for his silence that I could accept, the way the sea sometimes whispered it was better to let go. Then I'd light the edge of the paper and watch the flames eat my grief. The act felt cleansing, like washing your hands in hot water until the ache numbs. But while I cleansed, I also planned. The idea of revenge or justice, depending on how you want to label it, made me uncomfortable at first. That old question, is it right, kept gnawing at me. I reflected on Robert and the kind of man he was. I thought about the lessons I wanted to pass on to anyone who'd listen. Honesty, dignity, the work of your hands matters. I didn't want to become a caricature, a woman who'd do anything to cause pain. I wanted to expose truth, Nothing more. Truth, after all, tends to be sticky and slow, but devastating when it lands. One night, as the fog rolled thick over the harbor, Mrs. Dean brought me a folder she'd been saving. She'd been collecting things quietly. Photos of Daniel with Amira, pictures of receipts, notes she'd overheard. She'd been gathering them for months, not out of malice, but because she loved me and wanted me to have answers. Together, we pored over the folder by the light of my bedside lamp, piece by piece. There it was, a canceled check, made out in Daniel's name, deposited into an account that carried a different surname. There were wedding photos that showed Amira's family alongside Daniel's, and in a margin of a newspaper clipping, you know the kind, the local paper with the tiny font, was a mention of a business venture that Amira had started in his name. I can still feel the moment like a pressure in my skull. It was not shock I felt then. It was cold, precise realization. He hadn't simply abandoned me. He'd possibly been manipulated, lied to, made to think he was helping people who were helping him. Whether he knew about the missing money or not would be revealed later. For now, I held evidence in my hands. I began to imagine a path forward. I would confront them, not with a fist, but with documents. I would make sure the bank saw the canceled check, the Veterans Administration saw the discrepancy in his discharge records, and most importantly, the world that loved my son could see that someone had been rewriting his life at the cost of another's honesty. I would not slap them with a vengeance that broke bodies. I wanted a reckoning that broke lies. That's when I learned the virtue of allies. Revenge alone snarls you. A cause shared becomes public, and then often just. I recruited people without sounding like a conspirator. I invited them to coffee, to the church basement where I'd once handed out donuts after a funeral. I said, I'm trying to understand what happened to Daniel, and nobody could argue with that. They came with diaries and receipts and things they'd held on to, unsure why at the time. Suddenly, we had more than Mrs. Dean and me. We had a quiet committee, other mothers, old soldiers, a bank clerk with a conscience, a social worker who'd noticed discrepancies in benefits. There were moments I felt the old self, Evelyn the baker, stepping forward. The part of me that believed in community and second chances. If Daniel had been fooled, I wanted him to be forgiven. If he had been complicit, he needed to be held accountable. The line between the two can be fine, but it is real. So I kept my voice soft when speaking about him in public and saved the sharp edges for the facts I would lay down. When I finally decided to act publicly, I prepared a packet and wrote a polite letter requesting a formal review of the financial transactions and a meeting with the veterans liaison. I included copies of the canceled check, the recipient declined note, and the pictures. I sent the packet certified mail and kept a copy in a drawer under the bread box that used to hold my rolls. It felt strange, me, a grandmother, writing like a lawyer, but truth requires paperwork sometimes, and I know how to keep records. I remember the day the bank called. They wanted to talk. And when they did, they used different language that meant trouble. We are reviewing an account linked to a former customer. They said, and there appears to be irregular activity. My throat closed. The words were a kind of music, fierce and sweet. The veterans office replied, promising to look for forwarding addresses and to check into the discharge records. Meanwhile, life kept rolling. The nursing home smelled of disinfectant and the lemon-scented soap Mrs. Katz liked to bring. But under the ordinary surface of soup and bingo nights, small tremors were happening. People I had spoken to began to compare notes. Conversations that once were mundane turned to whispers about missing funds, about a woman who'd arrived with a wedding dress and a smile, about a young soldier who'd somehow lost his way. Anger comes in waves. For a while I felt only grief and cold resolve, but as the weeks passed, anger rose like the tide, slow, unstoppable. I found myself standing straighter when I went out for a walk, the way someone does when they are preparing to face something important. I practiced the conversation I would have with Daniel if I ever had him alone. I would say, "Why did you let her turn away a mother?" Then I imagined him answering, stumbling and ashamed. I wanted that moment to be honest, not theatrical. I wanted him to have to look at the paper trail and choose between truth and ease. Some nights, when I was too tired to plan, I would sit by the window and read the letters out loud to the sea. "Danny," I'd whisper, the name forming like a prayer. "You wrote, 'Don't worry, Mama. I'm coming home soon.'" I wanted him to know that the promise mattered, that it had anchored me through storms. I also wanted him to know that promises have weight, and when you shrug them off, the world notices. If you're still with me, press that like button now, because the next part, when actions take shape and the consequences begin, will move faster than this slow build. I'd rather it be a reckoning with truth than a collision with malice. Either way, I had no intention of fading quietly into the fog. I remember the day everything began to move like a machine finally wound tight enough to run. It was a thin, bright morning in late October. The fog had lifted, and the harbor looked almost polite, like it hadn't been keeping secrets. I'd waited long enough. I had packets of paper in my purse, copies of canceled checks, the recipient declined note, photographs, and a polite, plain letter to the bank demanding a full audit of any accounts connected to Daniel Monroe. I had a meeting arranged with the Veterans Liaison at noon and a quiet appointment with a lawyer friend who owed my late husband a favor. I felt oddly calm, the way a person feels when they set a loaf into the oven and know it will rise. First, I wanted the money trail followed. The bank people were slow and careful, the sort of people who hide their panic under a gray cardigan and polite language. I sat with a manager in a small, windowed office while she clicked keys and shuffled papers. "We're seeing transfers into accounts with a different surname," she said finally. "We need to subpoena records." Those words made my heart kick. Subpoena sounds like theater, but it's just a tool. My tools that day were truth and paperwork. The bank promised to act. I left with their promise in my pocket and a small, ridiculous thrill, like a woman who'd finally found a missing recipe. Next, the Veterans Liaison. He was a man in his 60s who smelled faintly of mothballs and coffee. He took the recipient declined note very seriously. "That's not a stamp they use for someone who moved," he said. "It's used when someone refuses mail. That could be a legal declaration." He agreed to look into discharge paperwork and any change of address forms. He promised discretion because he knew what discretion meant in a small town, a kind of social currency. And he respected that I needed time. While those formal things moved, I worked the informal channels, the ones that grease a town's wheels faster than subpoenas. I baked, of course. I took lemon squares to the diner where old soldiers gathered. I visited the little thrift shop where the postman's wife worked. I sat and listened and asked the right soft questions. People like to talk when you bring pastry. They feel safe. It's how I learned the small things, Amira had registered a business at a P.O. box. A woman at the florist remembered a wedding bouquet with an unfamiliar ribbon color. A former neighbor remembered cash being taken out at the ATM in odd amounts. None of it was proof by itself, but proof is a puzzle and pieces are gathered by patient hands. I also went where few would expect. I called the small foreign consulate listed on a dusty government site, the one that handled a lot of marriages for American soldiers and foreign nationals. I told them I was trying to verify a marriage date. Innocent, I said. Worried mother, always polite. They checked. They confirmed the date and added one more detail. The name used on the paperwork matched a different last name than the one she used in the photos. In other words, there were aliases. My breath went shallow. Names matter. Names can be where stories begin and lies are born. When you want to push a person into an honest corner, you have to tighten the space around them without looking like you designed the prison. For that, I needed community pressure. I quietly arranged a small veterans' coffee morning at the church hall under the pretense of sharing the biscuits I'd made. I knew many of Daniel's old unit mates would show up, men who'd taken care of one another in deserts and bases, and would not tolerate theft from one of their own. I asked Mrs. Dean to come and to bring whatever scrap she had that suggested financial oddities. It felt like calling an orchestra to begin with a single tuning note. When the men arrived, I poured coffee and handed out biscuits with a steady hand. Conversation started in the safe, lazy way it always does. News about knees, weather, names of people gone to heaven. Then, gently, Mrs. Dean passed a photograph to one of the veterans. "Do you remember this?" she asked. The man frowned and leaned in. His eyebrows flattened like someone pressing dough. He'd been with Daniel. He recognized something in the photograph that made his face change. "That's the woman from the base," he muttered. "She didn't tell us much." One by one, other men began to speak. Small things at first. Packages that didn't get to their destination, stipends that were misdirected, private conversations overheard. The conversation shifted from gossip into something more practical. A man named Roy said he'd seen checks endorsed in a different handwriting. Another, who worked briefly at the base supply office, mentioned a P.O. box used to reroute mail. That was the moment I felt the room fold into purpose. These were not idle rumors anymore. They were corroborations. Word moves in a corridor faster than any legal process. By the end of the week, the Veterans Liaison called to say the VA would open a formal inquiry. The bank's manager asked for additional documentation. I had help that I hadn't expected. A young paralegal named Tess, who worked at a legal clinic, reached out after seeing a flyer about a veterans help meeting. She said, "Ms. Monroe, I can put together a packet that the bank will take seriously." She did it in an afternoon with the energy of someone who smelled injustice and wanted to scrub it clean. While the formal machinery churned, I wanted Daniel to feel the perimeter closing. Not for vengeance, but for accountability. If he had been deceived, I wanted him to know the truth and face it. If he had participated, he needed to confront his choices. So I sent one email. It was polite, short and factual like a doctor's note. It said, "I have information about funds and correspondence you may not be aware of. Could we meet?" I used my new email with a pseudonym, Evelyn M. Contact, because I wanted him to come without immediate theatrics. It worked. He responded surprisingly quickly. The message was curt. "I don't know who this is." I sent back a photograph of his hand in mine from the time he was 6, mine taken from a drawer of old snapshots. That slowed him down. He wrote, "Is this you, Mama?" Finally, he wanted verification before he would act. I told him to come to the diner on Elm Street at 9 the next morning. He did. He walked in as if the town itself had given him permission, confidence wrapped tight like an overcoat. When he saw me, the confidence slipped. For a second, I saw the boy who used to eat blueberry muffins and tear open the paper bags. He sat down. We ordered coffee in silence, the clink of a spoon loud as knuckles on a door. "Mama," he said finally. It was a small admission that sounded like a sigh. I thought you were gone." "You thought I was gone?" I repeated. The words fell like stones. "You answered the mail stamp recipient declined, or you let it be answered. Which was it?" He looked at his hands as if they were new and foreign. "It was complicated." He said, "She said she wanted to start over. I sent money. I thought it was for paperwork. She said it was for flights, and then things kept happening." "Did you ask where it went?" I asked calm, because calm is a sharper tool than fury. "Did you look at the bank statements?" He swallowed. I didn't want to believe she'd do that to me. I thought his voice broke. He looked like a man who had read a manual without testing the tools. "I thought I was protecting you. Protecting me by not saying a word." I asked, "Protecting me by letting me send letters to a box that refused them?" The diner's bell chimed when someone came in. For a long time, neither of us spoke. The truth was not a single event. It was a slow accumulation. He'd been ashamed. He'd been wooed. He'd been frightened. Those things don't excuse choices, but they make them human. After the meeting, he asked to see the documents the VA and the bank had requested. I agreed. I had nothing to hide. He told me he would cooperate. He left promising recompense, apologies, explanations. For a time, I thought that would be enough. But truth moves in circles, and sometimes a person must be forced to walk the full arc. The next move was to secure the records publicly. I worked with Tess and the Veterans Liaison to request copies of transfer receipts, the VA's investigation notes, and the bank's internal findings. When the bank produced the records, they showed pattern after pattern, small wires to an account with a certain surname, checks endorsed differently, signatures that looked similar but had tiny inconsistencies. The handwriting analyst I paid months ago, yes, I had continued to pay for help when I could, confirmed that some endorsements did not match Daniel's actual signature. The analyst's report was clinical and cold, and it felt like court scripture. It said, in plain terms, what I already felt. Someone had been profiting from my son's generosity. I took those reports to the county's attorney. He was a quiet man, unshowy, who liked to make things right the clean way if he could. He read the documents and nodded. We can file charges for fraud if evidence supports that someone knowingly cashed money intended for a veteran's next of kin, he said. There's a path. I remember the first time I saw the name on the indictment papers. Seeing an alias spelled out in official ink has a peculiar finality. It's like catching a photograph of a ghost. Amira's name, along with others connected to the P.O. boxes and shell accounts, appeared across the pages. The case unfolded like a play you could not unsee. When the sheriff made a quiet visit to her business address, she was shopping in a boutique uptown, unaware she was being followed. That night, there were questions and a folding chair and a detective with a soft appetite for the truth. She was arrested on suspicion. Privacy laws and legal caution meant the word used was detained, and the town waited perched like birds on a wire. When the first press release came from the bank and the veterans office, I felt something strange. Not joy, exactly, but a clean sort of relief, as if a wound had been rinsed. It was public now. The world had a record. Daniel, for all his shame, had cooperated. He sat in interviews and apologized in a voice that had grown hoarse. He said things about being manipulated and about being too proud to admit he'd been wrong. The townspeople who had once looked sideways now nodded at me in recognition, as if to say, "We're sorry." Those nods softened the cold a little. Revenge, in the way I'd imagined it, never looked like burning anything to ashes. It looked like light on paper, light from subpoenas and bank audits, light that made rust appear where charm had tried to hide rot. It looked like a courtroom where the truth was read like scripture, and the perpetrator saw, in print, what her choices had done. The trial was not cinematic in the way films make such things pretty. It was long and methodical. Witnesses came in, including some of the veterans who had seen packages misdirected. The handwriting analyst testified. The bank manager explained transfer patterns. Amira's defense was loud at first, denials, clever arguments about misunderstanding and misapplied signatures, but the documents were stubborn. She had been careful, but she had not been careful enough. When the judge read the verdict, the room, heavy with the smell of old wood and lemon polish, felt like a held breath released. Guilty, not guilty of everything, for the law is a narrow instrument, but guilty of making false endorsements and misappropriating funds. Restitution was ordered, the bank would recoup what it could, and the VA arranged to forward any remaining benefits directly to a trust account managed by the county for veterans next of kin. It wasn't perfect. No action ever is. But it was corrective. People asked me afterward if I felt triumphant. I felt, more than anything, that a ledger had been balanced. I felt the deep, weary satisfaction of knowing the truth had its teeth again. Daniel came around in fits and starts. He did the work to make amends, public apologies, helping to organize a small fund for veterans' families who had been affected, and most importantly, sitting with me on slow afternoons while the above-water part of our relationship started to teach itself how to be honest. If you've stayed with me this long, sweetheart, please hit subscribe if you haven't yet. Because this part of my life, this unspooling of lies and the practical justice that followed, taught me one thing: revenge is not about ruin. It's about restoring the dignity that was taken. The sea is a patient listener. I would sit on the edge of the pier sometimes, letters in my lap, and feel the wind comb through the pages. I'd say the word truth the way you say a blessing, soft, deliberate. The world had offered me a strange kind of remedy, paperwork, witnesses, and the stubbornness of law. It had also offered me a son who, finally, could look at what he'd done and choose the hard path forward. There were, of course, further twists. People I trusted who'd once been friendly turned out to have small roles in the chain of deception, and there were bitter nights when restitution couldn't make up for lost years. But those are small ripples compared to the Maine tide. The Maine tide had turned, and it carried me towards something I hadn't expected, a quiet reclamation of the life I'd built, and the knowledge that I had not faded quietly into the fog. The weeks after the trial felt unreal, like I had stepped into a world where the past was a series of letters slowly burning behind me, while the present carried its own weight. The nursing home smelled the same, salty and antiseptic, but somehow the air felt lighter. I still sat by the window every morning, tea in hand, watching the waves roll over the rocks, but now I could do it without that constant ache in my chest. Daniel came by more often after that, cautiously at first, like a man walking on thin ice. And I let him. He apologized endlessly, not the kind of apologies that erase mistakes, but the ones that acknowledge them and commit to something better. We talked about everything. The letters I had written and never sent, the money that had been stolen, the lies he had been told and had told himself. Sometimes we laughed. Sometimes we cried. Sometimes there was silence that wasn't painful, just the quiet of two people learning to exist together again. The nursing home staff began to notice a change in me. I had a spring in my step I hadn't carried for years. They asked what the secret was, and I'd just smile and shake my head. The truth was too delicate, too satisfying to be shared casually. It wasn't vengeance that lifted me. It was the restoration of dignity, the reclaiming of a life that had almost been stolen. I also made sure Amira faced consequences beyond the courtroom. She had to deal with the fallout in the community, the bank audits, the awkward conversations with people who had trusted her. Watching her navigate that, I felt a quiet vindication. Justice, I realized, doesn't always have to roar. Sometimes it whispers through letters, papers, and careful steps that reveal truth slowly but relentlessly. One afternoon, I went to the post office, that same little post office I had visited for decades, and sent the first batch of letters that were meant to be read. They weren't apologies or reminders of betrayal. They were a kind of closure. To friends, to family, to the people who had helped me gather facts. And I included one for Daniel, a long one detailing the truth as it had unfolded, the steps taken to recover what was lost, and the hope that he would never let silence or fear prevent him from telling the truth again. There were moments when I wondered if my heart could heal completely, if the empty years would ever feel full again. But slowly they did. I found small joys, baking again for the local community, walking along the shore with friends, and yes, even looking at my unopened letters with a sense of peace rather than bitterness. The letters had served their purpose, teaching me patience, resilience, and the quiet power of persistence. I realized something fundamental. Life doesn't always hand us the justice we expect, but it gives us opportunities to claim it in ways that matter. By staying true to myself, by keeping careful records, asking the right questions, and trusting the allies I had gathered along the way, I had restored balance, not just for myself, but for my son, and for every small, overlooked truth that had been buried in silence. Sometimes when the fog rolls in and the waves hit the rocks just right, I sit by the window and think about all the letters I wrote, all the love I poured into envelopes that never arrived, and I whisper to the wind, you see, life always comes back around. I tell you this, my dear listener, because there's a lesson hidden in the sorrow. Never let silence or absence make you doubt your worth. Keep writing, keep speaking, and keep holding on. Even when the letters are faded, even when the world has turned its back, the truth has a way of finding its home. So, if you've been with me all this way, I hope you take this to heart. And before you go, hit that like button and subscribe. Because some stories, especially the ones that survive decades of silence, are worth hearing and worth sharing. And that, my friends, is how I found